Over the years, several folks have asked me various questions about the time frame between the cross and the empty tomb. And these questions generally boil down into two main questions. First of all, did Jesus really descend into hell? And second, what happened while Jesus was dead? What happened between the time he was laid in the tomb and he was resurrected? Where was he and what was he doing? The simple answer, I can give you some scriptures here to look up at your convenience. Matthew 12, verse 40. Ephesians 4, verses 8 through 10. Colossians 2, verses 13 through 15, and especially verse 15. 1 Peter 3, verses 18 and 19. And Acts 2, 22 through 28. I love cartoons, and I love puns. In the cartoon, The Wizard of Oz, I don't know if you're familiar with that cartoon, but the king is walking out of the church and he says to the friar, "You said that your Lord descended into hell." To which the friar replies, "Well, actually, he just dropped in to pick up the keys." And on the marquee in front of the church are the scripture references Matthew 12:40, Ephesians 4:9, and Revelation 1:18. So, did Jesus descend into hell? And if so, why? Well, to paraphrase a popular quote, it all depends on what your definition of hell is. There are 5 words in the Bible, 2 in the Old Testament and 3 in the New, that are translated as hell, or the place of the dead in various translations like King James, New American Standard, NIV, New Living Translation, and so forth. These words are also translated as death, Hades, the grave, the pit, destruction, words to that effect, depending on what translation you're using. In the Old Testament, Sheol is the most commonly used word, and the other word is Abaddon, which is often translated as destruction, as it describes what happens to the dead in that place, more so than describing the place itself. But Sheol, it seems, is a sort of a holding place for the spirits of the dead. Both the good go there as well as the bad. Jacob, who would be good, speaks of going there in Genesis 37:35 and again in 42:38. And David speaks of going there in 1 Samuel 2:6. It is also a place where the bad go, in Numbers 16:30, Psalm 55:15, for just a couple examples of many. In the New Testament, there are 3 commonly used words which are all, depending on the translation, rendered as hell. Tartaru is one of the New Testament equivalents of Sheol. It's only found in the New Testament in 2 Peter 2, verse 4. It is the part of hell, or Hades, that is reserved for the fallen angels who are to be held until the final judgment that we read about in Revelation 20. Hades is another New Testament equivalent of Sheol. It is also translated as hell in the New Testament, but mostly when you're using the King James Version. This is a word that is used in Luke 16:19 through 31, when we find the story of the rich man and Lazarus, as well as describing what will happen to some cities in Galilee that reject Jesus' teaching. You find that in Matthew 11:23 and Luke 10:15. Now this seems to be the place of disembodied wicked spirits or unbelievers, this Hades. The third New Testament word for hell is Gehenna. This is the place of the lost or the condemned. It is the place of torment for both the body and the soul, where, according to Mark 9:44, 46, and 48, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. This is what is commonly referred to in Revelation as the second death. This is where death and Hades will be thrown after the great white throne judgment. This will be the place of eternal punishment of the resurrected body and soul of the unbeliever. You can refer to Matthew 10:28 and Luke 12:15 for that. There are a couple more additional or more encouraging words for places of the departed. The first is paradise. That's a good one, paradise. That's found in Luke 23:43, where Jesus tells the thief on the cross that today You will be with me in paradise. Paul also speaks of being caught up into paradise in 2 Corinthians 12:4, and then in Revelation 2:7, the paradise of God is promised to the overcomer. I love the word paradise. The word paradise is from the Greek word pardasios, and it means the king's private garden. It's the New Testament equivalent of the Hebrew word pardes, which is the word used for the Garden of Eden. The second encouraging word is found again in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. In Luke 16:22, Lazarus is said to be carried to Abraham's bosom after he dies. According to Vincent's word studies, this is a rabbinical phrase equivalent to being with Abraham in paradise. So what does this all mean? Did Jesus descend into hell or not? Be patient. This information that I've shared is gathered from respected biblical studies and books such as Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, Thayer's Greek Definitions, the King James Concordance, the Complete Word Study Dictionary, and other places. But the following, what comes now, is what I have gleaned through prayer and meditation from this study. But still, let me be quick to say, this is what I believe, and it is subject to my own growth in the future. But now, having said this, let me share. First of all, I believe that there is biblical support for levels of reward for the believer. I've often used the phrase that we are saved by faith and we're judged by works. And I believe this is supported by such scriptures as 2 Corinthians 5:10, 1 Corinthians 4:5, 1 Corinthians 3:8 through 15, as well as Matthew 5:21 through 23, to name just a few. So it stands to reason, well, at least to me, that if there are different rewards, there would also very well be different levels of judgment. And it appears that Sheol is the place of the dead, and then within Sheol, I'm speaking about the Old Testament here, within Sheol there is, or was, paradise, or Abraham's bosom, where the spirit of the Old Testament believer resided before Christ came. There is Hades, the current place where the spirit of the wicked reside, that is non-believers. Tartaru, which is reserved for the fallen angels from Lucifer's fall, and possibly from Genesis 6, depending on your interpretation of that. Also see 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 1:6. And then finally there is Gehenna, which is the lake of fire and brimstone. This is the place where, after the great white throne judgment, death and Hades will be cast along with the fallen angels. You can read about that in Revelation 14:10, 19:20, 10 through 15, and also Matthew 25:41 and 46. So, to which of these places did Jesus go between the cross and the empty tomb? Well, first of all, most scholars agree that on the cross Jesus suffered and died. His body was put to death and his spirit was made sin. But his spirit was not left in hell. We see that in Acts 2:31. He yielded it to the Father. According to 1 Peter 3:19, between the cross and the empty tomb, Jesus preached to the spirits in prison. So this begs the question, who were these spirits that he visited, and what did he preach to them? There are two major thoughts on this subject. Some very well-respected scholars and commentators believe that Jesus went into Sheol, led all of paradise, that is, those Old Testament believers who were once held captive, he led all of them to heaven with him. This is supported by Ephesians 4:9 and especially by 2 Corinthians 12:4, where Paul talks about being caught up into paradise. Another train of thought, held by equally respected scholars and commentators, is that Jesus went into Hades and maybe even to Tartaru and preached to the dead, that is, the unbelieving spirits and or the fallen angels. If this is true, does it mean that there's a second chance for unbelievers? The key here lies in the word preached. Now, when you and I think of preaching, we think of the gospel, the good news. However, the word itself simply means to proclaim. So what is proclaimed may or may not be good news. In this case, what is good news for believers was not good news for the spirits in prison. What Jesus preached or proclaimed was his victory over Satan, his victory over death, and his victory over the grave. You can also see that in Colossians 2:15. So in this regard, Ephesians 4:8 and 9 means that he symbolically paraded the captives through the streets, as was a common occurrence in Old Testament times, and that his subjects, that is his believers, received the gifts or the spoils of the battle. Now for a picture of that, you can look at Psalms 68:18 and 1 Samuel 30 verse 26. So, did Jesus descend into hell? The answer is yes and no. Again, it all depends on what your definition of hell is. I believe that between the cross and the empty tomb, that Jesus descended into Hades and maybe even Tartarus, but not Gehenna, not the final hell, which is the place of the final judgment. He descended there and he proclaimed victory over Satan, over death, and over the grave. And then I believe he took possession of the keys of Hades. He liberated paradise, and he took the Old Testament saints to heaven where paradise resides today. I believe that for the child of God, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. I believe that the moment a believer dies, he or she is in the presence of God in paradise, in the King's private garden, awaiting the time when the final judgment will take place, after which the new heaven and the new earth will appear, and the believer will receive his brand new resurrected body. So I want to close with this, as Titus 2:13 reminds us. The believer has a blessed hope, which is the appearing of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ. And so I ask, do you know him today? I pray that he is your blessed hope too. Amen.